And in your piece, you write about the 1960s and Islamic socialism and how the elder Assad, the father, was part of the neoliberal turn in Syria. How did that transition happen exactly?
Yeah, okay. So not so much, I wouldn't say Islamic socialism, I'd say Arab socialism. Specifically, we are talking about this kind of heydays in the 1950s and 1960s, where across the Middle East, Syria included, you have a wave of coup d'etats against the existing political regimes, including the monarchy in Egypt and the rise of Nasser, the fall of the monarchy in Iraq, the overthrow of the Syrian government in 1949. So there's basically you have across large swaths of the Middle East a kind of shift away from let's say more pro-Western orientated governments. Many of these governments sort of were kind of post-colonial governments that the British and the French had never really withdrawn from. But in the 1950s and 60s, there's kind of this revolutionary wave across the Middle East manifest in a series of coups d'etats against various governments. And in Syria, this takes the form of the rise of the Ba'ath Party in the 1960s, and in the 1960s, partly in response to the rise of very powerful socialist and communist movements, the Ba'athist movement in Syria adopts a program of state nationalization. The state kind of takes the lead in economic development, etc., etc. This is kind of the height of the Cold War, the height of state capitalism, state-led developmentalism, and so on and so forth. However, already by the 1970s, across the Middle East, the luster of that kind of state-led form of economic development is, the wheels are coming off, and we see beginning, in Egypt with the famous, I think it's 1974 Intifah law, the opening law. You see this move away from kind of state-led economic development towards a process of liberalization. I wouldn't call it neoliberalization at this point in history, but in the 70s, we begin to see many of the quote-unquote Arab socialist regimes, Nasserist regimes, begin to move towards, giving the private sector a larger role in economic development. And of course, as time progresses, and especially following the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the kind of impetus behind this process of economic liberalization continues. Under Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, in particular in the 1990s, fueled by money from the Gulf, there is a kind of shift towards a greater role for the private sector in economic development. That's not to say that the government completely abandoned the economy. That's not to say all the social welfare provisions had been rolled back, but we begin to see this kind of shift towards sort of a more private sector model of economic development. It's very much this moment, that we think of when we, talk about global history, this end of history moment where the kind of socialist model is seen as a dead end. And so the question is how to move towards a kind of more private sector-led version of economic development. This is not just in Syria. Even in countries like Iraq, for example, you had just before the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein was trying to attract foreign investment, et cetera, into the economy. Now, in the year 2000, Hafiz al-Assad, who's ruled since coming to power in a coup d'etat in the early 1970s, ruled with an iron fist, basically suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood, fought a low-level civil war in the 1980s against the Muslim Brotherhood, was responsible for a lot of massacres, and was hated by many of Syria's Sunni Arab majority. He was a member of the Alawite community, which is a heterodox Islamic sect. more on the Shia side of the spectrum in the Islamic faith. And just as in Iraq, Baathism, pan-Arab nationalism served as a vehicle or a cover for the minority rule of the Sunnis. In Syria, you had a kind of similar situation where the Alawite minority, from which Assad came from, was constituted the social base of the regime. That's not to say all Alawites were kind of pro-regime. There was a hierarchy, but Assad kind of based himself in this community. When he died, his son, Bashar al-Assad, became president. Bashar al-Assad was never meant to be president of Syria. His older brother was the one being groomed for power, his older brother Basil, but he died in a car crash in the 90s. And so Bashar al-Assad, who was an optician, I believe working in Britain at the time, is brought back and kind of groomed for power.
Would you say he stumbled into power?
He stumbled into power. He was, he was the second. He was not the heir. He was the spare, and he, became the guy who needed to be. He became the new guy. He comes to power in the year 2000, and there's a kind of echo of our current moment in Syria. I think a lot of people hope that the old hardline military officer Hafez al-Assad, his son, who's like a mild-mannered optician, would sort of take the country in a different direction, would open the way for a kind of political liberalization in the country. And you have this moment in the early 2000 where it's known as the Damascus Spring. There's a kind of open political atmosphere. A lot of Arab Syrian intellectuals come together. They establish civil society organizations, discuss the future of the country. And then alongside this, as I mentioned, there is already this move towards liberalization of the economy, beginning in the 70s and really picking up in the 90s. But under Bashar al-Assad, alongside promises of political reform, there's this promise of economic reform. Remember, at this moment in history, people think, neoliberalism can deliver the goods to people. All we need to do to build our country up is to, encourage the private sector, unleash the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
So the political side of this liberalization project doesn't last very long. By 2001, basically the intelligence state, what they call the mukhabarat, the intelligence services, the intelligence state really reasserts itself. Opposition figures are people critical of the government are put in jail, and again, basically everything is clamped down on again. But when it comes to the economic reform, between 2000 and the outbreak of the civil war in 2011, there is basically a kind of intensification of neoliberalization. Hafez al-Assad, for example, had kept international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank at arm's length. Under his son, they come into the country. Business rates are cut, parts of the economy, land are privatized, taxes are reduced. The agricultural sector is hit, to my understanding, is hit particularly hard by this. And of course, at the same time, you have the rolling back of the social welfare state. One of the reasons for Hafez al-Assad's success in the past, of course, had been violence, but there's also was a kind of social contract where the Syrian state would look after you. This, of course, is rolled back as part of this neoliberal project. And so we have a period of time where, Syria is enjoying like 5% a year GDP growth. But that growth is being siphoned off to a political elite tied to the state. Neoliberalism is very, how can I put it, very susceptible to the authoritarian model of government, because the government, decides who gets contracts, can can use its influence, and you have the formation of a kind of new upper capitalist class, business class in the country, many of whom are relatives of the president or have political connections to the president, and they benefit very much from this neoliberal economic term. Perhaps